Do you ever feel really torn between two different decisions? Are you ever maybe stuck in a dilemma that requires you to make a decision based on certain choices? This isn't uncommon, right? This is something we face every day. We make choices. I'm sure this happens to you every day. I'm sure probably this afternoon when you were choosing somewhere to go eat, you had to choose somewhere that was pleasing to your family, or a lot of times maybe it wasn't. That's what used to happen when I was at home. Me or my brother or sister would get upset because it wasn't quite exactly what we wanted that given Sunday. There's lots of things that happen like that. Sometimes these decisions are easy. Sometimes they come with a choice that's easier than others. But sometimes we have decisions that we would characterize them as a lose-lose situation, perhaps. When my brother was younger, he still loves to watch football, but when he was, like 3 years old or 4 years old, he would play this game where he would love to choose random football teams and ask us who would win. Not who we thought would win, but who we wanted to win. Things like Boise State versus Boston College. Like these are teams that I could care nothing about. But the worst was when he chose teams like Alabama and Florida and made me choose who I would rather win. That's a lose-lose situation. I would tell him my answer would be, I wish, the game gets canceled and no one gets to win, because I can't stand to see either of those teams win. Right? There's decisions like that we end up in a lose-lose. But on the flip side, there's win-win decisions, win-win scenarios where, right, the decision sometimes is even more difficult than where both options are negative, because both options are so good and pleasing and things that we want that it makes it really hard to decide what we're going to come to a conclusion about. And that's where Paul finds himself in our text. Philippians chapter 1, if you haven't already flipped there, that's where we'll be. Philippians chapter 1, Paul is faced with two different decisions, both being great, and yet he's struggling to choose between these two things. Paul has this split decision, and as he addresses the Philippian church, he lets them in on a secret. He lets them on this secret that if he lives, he realizes he's got something to live for. If he lives, he's living for Christ, but if he dies, he's gained something that he's been looking forward to for so long. Verse 21, his decision, "For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." If he leaves prison, he can continue his ministry. And if he continues his ministry, he can help bring others to Christ. But if he stays in prison, if he dies, then it's gain for him. Paul wants them to know he's living in this win-win situation, so he goes on to explain his desires for both. He first explains the desire he has to remain on in this earth. Why would Paul want to remain on this earth? Well, he says he knows that if he continues to live on in the flesh, if he continues in his ministry, if he's in prison or not, then he gets to live for Christ. And if he lives on in the flesh, he knows he will continue to apply himself to teaching and being a fruitful laborer. Verse 22, "But if I live on in the flesh, this will mean fruit from my labor, yet what I shall choose, I cannot tell." Paul remains on this earth. If he does, he says the gospel will be furthered to many. And what greater blessing, he decides, can there be? Remember, this congregation that Paul is writing to is a church that Paul has visited in the past. And Paul is letting them know that everything that has happened in the past has happened for the gain of the gospel. That's what he goes back if we backtrack into verse 12 and 14. "But I want you to know, brethren, that the things which have happened to me have actually turned out for the furtherance of the gospel, so that it has become evident to the whole palace guard and to all the rest that my chains are in Christ. And most of the brethren in the Lord, having become confident by my chains, are much more bold to speak the word without fear." Paul knows if he lives on, he has a goal to live for. If he remains on this earth, the gospel is furthered to many, and he knows this because he's seen what the gospel has done while he's in prison. Again, this is where Paul visited in Acts chapter 16, where he was wrongfully whipped, wrongfully imprisoned, wrongfully had these mistreated, and yet he says to these people from that city that these things happened for the furtherance of the gospel. Even in those places that others would have never thought the gospel could be spread, Paul says, because of my situation, if I'm on this earth, I have this desire to remain because look where I can spread it. Even the whole palace guard, he says, even the whole palace guard and the rest, from verse 13, saw that Paul's chains were for Christ. But not only are those unbelievers impacted, but even the believers on the outside, Paul says. Down in verse 14, the other people who previously were fearful to spread the word, contrary to what the people who put Paul in prison would have thought, since Paul's in prison, they've become emboldened to spread the word because they see something powerful that Paul could preach under threat of death, so surely they could as well. But while in prison, Paul knows that if he's still alive, he wants to stay on earth for other reasons as well. He gets to preach, but he gets to hear others preach the gospel as well. He continues in verses 15 through 18. Some indeed preach Christ, even from envy and strife, and some also from goodwill. The former preach Christ from selfish ambition, not sincerely supposing to add affliction to my chains, but the latter out of love, knowing that I am appointed for the defense of the gospel. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached, and I will rejoice, yes, and will rejoice. Paul knew that some would preach the gospel from love, but others would not. But while some would preach from selfishness and perhaps out of contempt for Paul, wanting some of the gain that perhaps he had, the fame that he had claimed, he declares that he will rejoice that the gospel is preached regardless, because if he's on this earth, he has the opportunity to see it preached. Whether they're preaching from jealous ambition or whether they're preaching from sincerity, all Paul could do was rejoice, because on this earth, on the one hand, with his desire to remain on this earth, he gets to see the gospel preached and he gets to preach it himself. So Paul continues to live in this win-win situation. He craves their prayers as he has the desire to glorify God in all things, in whether it's his life or death. Verses 19 and 20, for I know that this will turn out for my deliverance, through your prayer and the supply of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, according to my earnest expectation and hope that in nothing I shall be ashamed, but with all boldness as always, so now also Christ will be magnified in my body, whether by life or by death. Whether life or death, Paul hopes that Christ will be magnified in his body, and he says that gives him another reason to continue on in the flesh. Whether he's preaching to the thousands of guards and the others in the prison, or whether he's providing encouragement to those that are outside who see him and are bold because they see what Paul is going through and how they can do the same, or whether he's able to get out and preach to others, Paul wants to remain on earth so the gospel is preached. Whether he's free from the jail or whether he's in there, he wants to stay. He wanted to live for Christ, but as verse 22 says, yet what I shall choose, I cannot tell. He has a goal to live on this earth. Now, let me ask, are we really living our lives with a desire? Are we truly running our lives with a desire to live for Christ on this earth? Are our lives filled with the desire to live on in the flesh, not for fleshly desires, but so that we can further the kingdom, whether we are in prison or whether we are out, or whether we are spreading the word to believers or not? It appears too often that we live our lives in the same manner every day. We go to work or school and sprinkle in a few activities here and there depending on the day of the week, and a little bit of church every now and then to ease the conscience. And how often do we wake up and really realize what a blessed situation we live in? Do we really stop to think that no matter what happens to me today, I have the opportunity to live for Christ, and no matter whether by life or death, I will glorify Christ in my body? Think of all the good that we can do here on earth. How often do we really adopt the mindset of Paul, that the things that have happened to us, whether good or bad, have turned out for the furtherance of the gospel? How often do we, fortunately, many of us, I don't believe, have gone through the things that Paul has gone through, and he can say these have turned out for the furtherance of the gospel. Can we say the same thing for what has happened to us? Perhaps missing that promotion at work was a blessing because it allowed me to remain with someone who needs to hear the gospel, where else I wouldn't have been with them at that time. Or making it not into that school or that class is a blessing because now I'm still with these believers who need to be encouraged. Or maybe that devastating event like the medical condition or the loss of the relationship or the loss of the job or the passing of a loved one or whatever it is another opportunity for the gospel to be furthered. Paul didn't gripe that he was put into prison, and he didn't complain that he was in there. He saw it as a new opportunity because outside prison, he wouldn't have been able to reach those prison guards, but inside, he now was able to build a relationship with them. Even in prison, he could embolden other Christians because they could see him living for Christ and want what he had. So let his attitude serve as a reminder. Are we doing good here on earth, no matter the situation we're put in? Do we rejoice when we wake up every day? Because today is a new day to serve the Lord and to be blessed in his service. Is today truly a day to live for Christ, a day where if we continue on in the flesh, we bear fruit from our labor, as verse 22 says? Is the way we're living reflecting Christ as the only Bible someone might ever read, or are we complacent and think that today is simply another thing that we have to spend it as we want on our own pleasures, not realizing that we're in a situation where we have the ability to live for Christ? How often do we say that we look forward to today and tomorrow because every day is a new opportunity to spread the gospel? Paul knows that it would be great, and he wants to remain in the flesh. So on one hand, Paul tells them his desire, his earthly desire, not sinful, but earthly, that he remain on this planet so that he can talk and spread the truth. But Paul also has another desire. He moves into 23 and shares them his heavenly desire. For I am hard pressed between the two, having a desire to depart and be with Christ, which is far better. While Paul wants to remain on this earth, he also has this strong inner desire to go to heaven, as he concludes in verse 22 that what he will choose he cannot tell. He's hard pressed between these decisions. He's between this rock and the hard place. He has this desire to go be with Christ, a deep desire that he also speaks of in 2 Corinthians 5 when he talks about leaving this tent to go be in our home in heaven. Paul has this longing, this picture that everything inside of Paul, from his inside out, he's being pulled towards heaven. He wants to get to heaven. Everything about him wants to get there. For he says being with Christ is far better. But why would being with Christ be far better? Well, it's better because Christ has gone to prepare a place for us, and in that place is where Christ is at. He reminds us of that in John 14:2-3. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you, I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go to prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you, that where I am, there you may be also. That place that's better is with Christ. Being with Christ in the place He's prepared is better because Christ is there. As David reminds us in Psalm 16:11, you will show me the path of life. In your presence is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. Paul wants to go be with Christ in that place because unlike earth, where we labor and toil, and where there's sadness and sickness and sorrow and all of these things that make life quite often miserable, in this place with Christ, there's none of those. For in the beautiful picture of heaven in Revelation 21, verses 3 and 4 says, And I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and He will dwell with them. And they shall be His people. God Himself will be with them and be their God. And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no more pain, for the former things have passed away. We sing songs that remind us of the truth that being with Christ is far better. Songs like No Tears in Heaven and Heaven Will Surely Be Worth It All. It should seem obvious to us why Paul would say it would be better to go be with Christ. Heaven is a great reward, a reminder of why we're doing what we're doing. So yes, we should wake up every day and want to remain on earth to serve, but do we have a heavenly mindset while we're doing it? Can we say that we have a strong desire to go and be with Christ, or is there something on earth that's coming up that might seem a little bit more tempting to stay for than a home in heaven? Can we really say that we're not too lost on this earth, and can we say we have a heavenly desire to go and be with Christ? Paul reminds them that we should all have a strong desire to be with Christ as well. So Paul finishes with his decision. Verses 24-26, he's left with this decision, right? On the one hand, he tells them, I can stay here on earth, and that's good, it's better for you, and I can do all these things and serve Christ, and I'm in this situation where I can bring others to Him. But on the other hand, right, I can go and be in heaven. And what's better than that? What could be better than that? He's examined his situation, and he's concluded that he's living in a win-win situation where nothing can be wrong. He can live on in the flesh and work for Christ, or he can go be with Christ, which would be far better. So he comes to his conclusion in verses 24-26. Nevertheless, to remain in this flesh is more needful for you. And being confident of this, I know that I shall remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy of faith, that your rejoicing for me may be more abundant in Jesus Christ by my coming to you again. Paul comes to the decision that his own desires will be put aside so that he can help them on earth. How easy would it have been for Paul to have concluded that it was time for him to go? Because he's already in prison, right? Who else could say that they had done more than Paul? Who is more worthy of the kingdom than Paul? Who has done more? Who has brought more souls to Christ? Who has done these things? Who is more worthy? And who could say that they are really ready to go other than Paul? And yet, rather than seeking that own desire, Paul put away his selfishness so that he could help others get to heaven, and he looked at something more important than that own desire. Paul says he'll spend his time on earth preparing for a place in heaven, helping everyone he can to get there. He hopes he'll be given more time on earth, but not for his own gain, but for the sake of others. He desires to remain so that they could see them progress in their own faith, and so that they'd all rejoice together in Jesus Christ. Are we willing to put away our desires for the sake of the kingdom? Do we view our time here not as our own, but as time spent working for God? If we remain on this earth, our entire focus should be upon progressing in the faith and bringing others to Christ. So Paul makes his decision. If he's on this earth, he will work for Christ. And he goes on to tell just a little bit to these people, to the Philippians, about if they are blessed to remain on this earth, what their conduct should look like. Paul has told the Philippians about the dilemma he's living in, and he gives them his conclusion. On the one hand, he could stay. On the other, he can go. But if they are going to stay, if he's going to stay, their conduct must be favorable to that of Christians. Let their conduct be worthy. Paul speaks to them in verse 27, "Only let your conduct be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of your affairs, that you stand fast in one spirit, with one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel." Our conduct is held to a standard. Consider how high the expectations are that are given by Paul. Let your conduct be worthy of the gospel of Christ. Is there anything we can do that makes our conduct worthy of the gospel of Christ? What can we even begin to do to be worthy? The standard that Paul sets, that Paul gives, that's given by the Lord, is practically unreachable, and yet we're still called to reach it. So thankfully, this practically unreachable standard is given with a qualification of how we can fulfill it. If our conduct is to be worthy of the gospel of Christ, then our conduct should be so that everyone who's around us and everyone who's away from us should see what we're doing and should know what we're doing. Every single person should know that we're Christians. Every single person we're close to, that we have a relationship with, that we know and love, that we trust, should know that we're Christians. And every single person that we're not close to should know that we're Christians. Every single person we meet, every stranger we come in contact with, every person we go to school with, every person we work with, every person that follows us on social media, every person that we see in every bit of our daily life should know we're Christians. What are we known for? What do others hear about us? What do those that are near to us know us for? Are we known as lovers of Christ, as people who will go out of our way to help our fellow men, to those who walk worthy of a conduct that if Christ was with us, we would be with Him and He would be proud of the way that we behave? Or are we driven by our other works? Are we taken over by our desires for something else? Are we known for something else that we want that is not worthy of that gospel? What about those people that aren't near us? What about the people that don't actually know us? What do they seem to know us for? Are we known as the ones who are known for our jobs, as being the ones who desperately try to climb the ladder, who do anything to get that next bonus or get that next thing, trying to show off our names to others, trying to show off what we've done and who we are and the things we can do? Or are we known from afar as Christians who love them and want to save their soul? What is the church here at Southgate known for? Do the people in the community see it as a group of believers who are working for the Lord and who provide a place for them to come and to have the love of the Lord shared with them, the truth of the Lord, and no matter what social discriminations they faced on the outside, they can come in and they can have the message of Jesus shared with them because they are worthy of salvation? Or is it a place that people want to avoid because others have been made to feel unwelcome and unwanted? What do the people from out of town think? What's the reputation from those in the county over, or the city over, or wherever it has been? Have they heard our affairs, seeing us stand fast in one spirit? Would Paul be able to write to us and say that he hears of our affairs and that we stand fast for the sake of the gospel? What if we were known for our worship? Or what if it was our Christian spirit or our love or our giving and benevolence that we were known for? Are we like the Philippians who Paul wrote to, that their conduct, he said he might hear of it from afar off, even in prison, he would hear of their conduct because they lived fully for Christ. Let's reach this high standard of being worthy of the gospel. How can we be known and seen as Christians? Well, number one, by standing fast with one mind. That's what Paul tells them, that you stand fast in one mind, with one spirit, with one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel. Think of the damage it does to the church when the church tears it apart itself from the inside. When Christians split and choose to leave over opinions, over things that do not matter because one way or the other, some people got upset, and now those that are outside the church are seeing us fight against each other rather than fighting against the evils of the world. What do those near and far think when they see us when we refuse to stand with one mind and one spirit? We're called to be one, working for the one Lord, working for the cause of Christ. All in one mind, all in one spirit, all pulling together, because the church is one, as Paul reminds us in Ephesians 4, verses 4 through 6. There is one body and one spirit, just as you were called in one hope of your calling. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all and through all and in you all. Let us adopt one mind, that one mind being the mind of Christ, the mind that rejects the earthly desires and chooses to work every day for Christ. When we have the mind, Paul continues and tells them, when you have this one mind and one spirit, you have no need to be scared of your enemies. Verse 28, and not in any way terrified by your adversaries, which is to them a proof of perdition, but to you of salvation, and that from God. What is the worst thing our enemies can do to us? Because if Paul is right about this situation, about this conflict he's living in, if they kill us, then thank the Lord because they've sent us to our reward. And if we don't die, then we stay on this earth and we have another opportunity, another day, another hour to spread the gospel to someone else and help them get to heaven. Truly, we live in a win-win situation because when the mind of Christ is in us and when we strive for the gospel, we live with no fear. And the lack of fear does two things, Paul says. First, it shows our enemies that they are in the wrong. It should scare them. It should show them the proof of their own destruction and their own fault. When we fail to be afraid of our enemies, what power can they have over us? Absolutely none, because they know they're doomed. And second, we're assured of our own salvation. We don't have to stand in fear, but we are assured of our own salvation, and that from God. There is no fear over us because we serve the God above. We've been given the privilege to suffer for Christ because we live for Him. That's how Paul ends his discussion on what he will choose in verses 29 through 30. For to you it has been granted on behalf of Christ, not only to believe in Him, but also to suffer for His sake, having the same conflict which you saw in me, and now here is in me. We've been given the privilege to suffer because we live for Him. We serve Him, and we are given the opportunity to suffer. And it might seem odd that suffering is a privilege, but for the great name of Jesus, what could be better? We should be thankful, like the disciples in Acts 5:41, who went on their way rejoicing because they were worthy of stripes for the cause of Christ. We are given that privilege to suffer, and when we live for Christ, we're living like Paul was in a win-win situation. We're living in a great conflict, not in a conflict of the earth, not in a conflict where we're fighting others, but where we're fighting in ourselves, because on one hand, we have the chance to live for Christ, and on the other hand, we have the reward that awaits us when we die. And both are incredible. And that's the conflict that Paul tells them about. We're living in the great conflict just like Paul was, because we're torn between staying on earth to spread His message versus going to be with Christ in the place He has prepared for us. So what can come that would shake us? We're living in a situation where no matter what happens to us, we cannot possibly lose. If we lose our life, we've gained eternity in heaven. If we've lost a job, perhaps we've gained a new opportunity to spread the gospel somewhere else. If a door has closed and we've lost it, perhaps it's because a new one has opened that we can go through and spread the gospel on the other side. If we live on this earth, we live for a goal of proclaiming Christ, and we have a task of bringing His message to all. If we die, then we go to the reward He's prepared for us, allowing us to be with Him for eternity. There is simply no way we lose because we live in a win-win, because we live for Christ and we long for heaven. So are we living for Christ? Is living here on earth viewed truly as an opportunity every day to wake up and reach some new soul for Christ? Someone that you have a relationship with that only you can help, that it won't matter if anyone else talks to them because they need you. Do we rejoice at the message of Christ being preached? The great news, the good news, the gospel, that He came and died for all. Do we long with our entire bodies to get to the heavenly kingdom and work with the entire body to bring others to that kingdom as well? Do others hear of our good works and our enemies see what we have done? Do they see that and stand scared because they know we cannot be shaken by any persecution to not live for Christ? Do others hear of our good works and want what we have because we have the love of Christ? Perhaps you have not been living with that same conflict that Paul faced. That same conflict in his life that on one hand he knows he can continue living for Christ, and on the other, if he dies, then that's all right with him. And perhaps you want to be in that conflict. It's a fight that we want to be in. Perhaps your life is not right and it never has been. Perhaps you have not responded to the call of Christ in baptism. Put Him on so that you can have that home in heaven for eternity. Or perhaps you have in the past, but that conflict in you has faded and it's not an everyday thing now to live for Christ. If we can help you in any way, if we can help you come and live for Christ or begin your life anew in Him, please no longer wait and come forward tonight as together we stand and as we sing.